So welcome everyone. We're so glad to have you here for the second episode of the Yale Blockchain webinar series. And I'm Diana. I'm a 2017 alum of the MBA program, and I'm in the blockchain space. I'm helping to advise the Parliament of Cyprus with their blockchain regulation. And I've also written research on stablecoins and setting standards for the space. And I'm so delighted to have here with me Cristina Dolan. She is an engineer from MIT and an entrepreneur who has started a number of fascinating technologies, including taking a company public in the early days of the internet. And she's also pioneered a lot of the interesting blockchain innovations and moved on to start one healthcare blockchain application, among many others. So welcome, Cristina. I'm so glad to have you.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. And Diana, you're amazing as well. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to sort of have a conversation about sort of the future of blockchain in this networked world.
That's amazing. So let's get started. And we were going to talk about today really in light of, because this semester we were going to talk about risk and blockchain in relation to reducing risk overall. And I love your approach about the fact that we're in a connected world and tying all the pieces together and connecting the dots. So it's not just about the tech, it's about the network. And could you say more about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you and I have a lot of different conversations about the technology itself. But what's interesting is that blockchain, I mean, obviously during the ICO phase, everybody was very excited about the technology, and you'd have teams of people that would innovate in one area, and then that team would branch off to create another technology and another technology. And there's like this great hyper innovation phase. But in reality, blockchain is a networked technology, right? So you need a community to engage. And if the community doesn't engage, then the value isn't created in that network. And, with respect to, like, for example, the Union Square Ventures has created an image that is shared a lot in the blockchain world, where you have the old fashioned, distributed information, right? The internet and the apps and the organizations like the Googles, the Facebooks, the applications that were built on top of the internet maintained all the value centrally. And then with respect to the blockchain world, they draw this picture that's somewhat siloed. And, on top of that is these distributed applications. And I think about it a little bit differently because we're in a networked world, right? And in this networked world, it isn't just the requirement for people to engage, but there's all these different technologies that have evolved over time, from IoT devices. You have cognitive capabilities that are incredible, right? The amount of computational capabilities that are at the edge of networks is huge now, right? Even if you think about what you have on your phone, right? So now you have a world which we call Industry 4.0, where blockchain is just one of the many rails, and you have all of these technologies networked together. You have data flying around this network, and then you have the ability to create new business models as a result of that. And that's where I think the great opportunities are going to be coming as a result of that.
And it's also the ecosystems, right? Because when we live in a connected world and these network technologies have to, we're thinking of Metcalfe's law that you talk about a lot, like phones. Yeah. Value is in the fact that a lot of people use it. Exactly. And creating the ecosystems, we're not going to create those ecosystems from scratch, but exactly, they're created over time.
Yeah. And I think that's what happened during the ICO phase. There was all this hyper innovation, but people forgot the fact that you needed the networking engagement at the sort of application layer, not at the, wow, this is great, let's have cheerleaders, cheer on the team. It really had to be at the engagement layer to really get that Metcalfe, effect in place.
Right. And I'm going to say also during this conversation, because I know that a lot of you sent questions beforehand from the form that we had. So we're going to touch upon some of those questions, but we're also taking questions in the Q&A. So feel free to submit your questions. But that makes me think of one of the questions that someone submitted about what lessons learned, I guess, can you say about the ICO phase and the future of DeFi, for example?
Well, I actually think that the ICO phase was great because this hyper innovation phase that took place actually created a lot of experimentation. And this experimentation allowed for the technology to be played with, new business models to be played with. Now, they didn't take off because you didn't have the, the community engaged in it, but there was a lot of experimentation and ideation. And a lot of people came together with a lot of enthusiasm to try out these ideas, but it was missing this network effect that is obviously has been a requirement for any of these technologies to take off. So, but what's interesting is that this network effect today is not just people, it's devices, it's cognitive capabilities. There's a lot of components that are creating this network effect, and blockchain is just one component of this overall network in which you have all of this computing, engagement, transactions, and of course, you and I've talked about, the data journeys that are captured throughout that, which is actually a very interesting aspect of blockchain.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? The wealth of different connected devices, and they're all measuring data, and
Exactly.
blockchain being a way to record the data, not as an alternative to a database, but with certain different capabilities. And when you raise the concept of journeys of data, and we're going to talk about that and define that a little bit better, but it's really interesting to think about faster and more powerful computing, along the lines of all the innovations at their core. And moving to the next topic, how does that touch upon transparency, which is what we're talking about, transparency and trust in light of security as new business models evolve?
What's interesting when we think about transparency, there's been some drivers that have made this capability very important. And first, you have to think about the regulators. There's AMLD 5 and 6. You're obviously working with regulators as well, and I've been working with regulators. That's obviously an area where there's tremendous interest in being able to have that level of transparency. And obviously, at the moment where the regulators realize how much transparency can be obtained from blockchain, which is not possible from traditional financial systems because everything's siloed. And so when money moves from one silo to another silo, there isn't that thread of transparency, right? But in the blockchain world, first of all, if money is stolen off one of the exchanges, it's registered in a database. So the exchanges, the crypto exchanges, are able to do a lookup and determine whether or not this is derived from one of those, hacks, for example. And so, that's not possible from, utilizing traditional technologies. And so blockchain has this ability to provide transparency, which is becoming more and more of a requirement. But it's not even just in financial systems for, AMLD 5 and know your customer. There's a lot of different, what I consider to be these data journeys that are a requirement today. You need it in healthcare. You want to understand where your pharmaceuticals are coming from, and now with COVID, for example, where you're moving, possibly moving vaccines from one location to another location, it has to be stored at a very cold temperature. And so being able to use IoT devices and capture the exact conditions under which these vaccines are being moved from one location to another is very important, because you want to know that if you're taking one of these vaccines, that it's actually going to work. It's also in the provenance of food, for example. Another one that actually has gotten a lot of publicity is one around diamonds, right? The ability to determine what the provenance.
Yeah.
Exactly, to make sure that they're not blood diamonds. So this idea of trust and understanding where your food's coming from, the products you're buying, the pharmaceuticals, when things are being shipped and they're in containers and they're being moved from one location to another location, having that level of transparency is becoming more and more important. But in addition to that, once again, the IoT devices, you can figure out, like, for example, the shipping containers in this Maersk use case that people have talked about. I think there's like over 20 IoT devices in each of those containers that allows for some level
a lot of data.
Yeah, it's a lot of data. And not to say that you need all of that data, but it provides a certain level of transparency. So blockchain provides that transparency at a time where people have a lack of trust and regulators need more data. And even going back before blockchain with MiFID, right? That was that was a regulation around trade data, right? So when a wealth manager or broker works with a client and they discuss some sort of a financial trade, everything from the conversation to the pricing on all the exchanges to the research, all the way to the end of that, the end-to-end process has to be recorded in such a way so that if at, within 24 hours or a short period of time, if the customer wanted some of that information with regard to the trade that was made, it has to be made accessible to them. So everywhere across all these different industries, you need to have this level of transparency and these journeys, which is one of the things that blockchain is able to capture. It's able to capture journeys of information across siloed systems, across a variety of different entities, right? And so some of that information might be generated by IoT devices. You might have, some sort of cognitive computational capabilities along these networks. Blockchain is not a technology allows for an analytics within the blockchain. It's just capturing that information. But then that information can be used to make decisions or, for compliance reasons or regulatory reasons. So from an overall networking perspective, there are some drivers that make blockchain very sort of critical in the world that we're living in today.
Absolutely. I think going back to the financial system and thinking of how we're still operating in a financial system that runs on an infrastructure that has really been designed during and for the Industrial Revolution for the trade of physical assets, where you had very large centralized parties to ensure trust and to ensure that the clearing and settlement would happen. But there's a delay between the trade and then the actual ensuring that the clearing and settlement actually occurs, which as a standard is like T+2 days, but in more complex financial products, it tends to be like weeks or it could be long. And that creates a host of risks, right? So using more transparent data, and to your point, the compliance, the way it could facilitate compliance is a very interesting topic to think about.
Exactly. And I think actually during the financial crisis, I mean, the founder of T0, the security token exchange, when he gives presentations, always likes to talk about, sort of the history of how, how the settlement process came about. But he also talks about what happened, during the financial crisis, in that the settlement process was kind of stuck because you had, a lot of different securities that were trying to be settled. But, it's not as if when you own a share of something, you own share 0001. It's like you have a share of something and it's settled with, a similar security. And so, it created a lot of confusion. And the other piece of that too is that when you have a portfolio of different securities at a particular financial institution, you basically have an IOU for those, right? So it's not. So there's a little bit of confusion, and of course, Broadridge is a company that's worth billions of dollars, and
very simple concept.
Yeah, so they basically try to figure out who owns what so you can vote, and I think they manage like 80% of the global publicly held, voting that takes place because of the fact that there is this sort of abstraction in terms of who owns what, and a bit of confusion whenever there's a vote. So I think that moving towards, I mean, there's been a lot of early use cases by the DTCC, and a lot of financial organizations have come together in order to streamline that process. But they always like to bring up the fact that if there's an issue with respect to a trade and you have to reverse it because one side hasn't necessarily fulfilled the requirements, you want to have a delay so that both parties are executing at the same time. And with crypto, it's possible that you have traditional financial payment and a crypto payment that are not necessarily settling at the same time, and so there's this counterparty risk that sort of evolves from that.
Right.
So I think that to some degree, you're going to have a sort of holistic, I want to say, replacement of some of these capabilities that's accepted by multiple organizations in order to, I think, be able to roll these out in mass.
Right, right. That's fascinating. Yeah. And thinking through a little bit more of the supply chain topics as well. I used to work for the Inter-American Development Bank, and there was a whole trade finance facilitation program, and just raising the point of the level, the complexity of these transactions and the level of paperwork that you need when you're dealing with a lot of different jurisdictions. And that again points to another case.
Yeah. And that's one of the areas that, early on was also being explored because of the simplicity of it, right? There's a lot of information that has to be exchanged. There's a lot of information that needs to be captured, and the ability to automate some aspects of that and simplify that. I mean, even with respect to when in the process of shipping, when a ship is coming into port, the amount of information that they have to exchange before they come into port is not insignificant. So finding mechanisms by which to automate that in a trusted way, offers a certain level of cost savings as well as other types of efficiencies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, and also another use case that we were thinking about had been the area of healthcare, right?
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about your startup and the journeys of data? Well, first of all, why don't we talk about what journeys of data are and clarify that?
Yes. So so as we were saying before, the regulators have always asked for sort of an understanding of the path of money, and in there's a lot of different industries that, like food, for example, provenance of money, and drug, where pharmaceutical ingredients. I mean, now even makeup companies want to be able to provide sort of a trusted insight in terms of where all the ingredients are coming from their products as well. And so this idea of being able to utilize a technology that is able to exist outside of siloed systems. Because I mean, for example, a supply chain is not one system, it's a bunch of different systems. So you could have, like, a farmer has their supply chain, and then they have their shipping company, and there's another shipping company. So, you can have a distributor in the middle. There could be a number of different entities between the origin and the destination that all have their own supply chain. So if you're trying to figure out where something came from without some mechanism outside of those siloed systems, it would be really difficult, because you'd have to ask to dig into each one of those siloed applications. So the beauty of blockchain in these journeys is that if you're able to create this journey of information that captures captures things like temperature or whatever the data points are that you need all across that journey, it means that you have a separate system that actually that you can access to gather that information.
And at the same time, there's a component of privacy, right? Because you
Yeah.
see the data, but you don't see the confidential information. And this leads to a lot of the GDPR concerns from the EU, and it can be very valuable.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of innovation on that area as well. I mean, obviously, there's a ton of different blockchains that have sort of evolved, over the last couple of years to address, a large variety of different use cases, let's say. But the privacy of the data. I mean, you can have pointers and then have the pointers access information in a separate system that has some sort of an encoding capability in order to keep the data private. So there are mechanisms from a technology perspective to keep the data private. But what's really hard is to recreate those journeys without having some sort of an external system by which you pull it together. And so for Additum, which is a company in the healthcare space, which I co-founded with the retired CEO of Medtronic, which is a company that's very big in the healthcare space, especially with IoT devices. And my other co-founder, was head of social medicine in Spain, had gone to Harvard, knew Michael Porter, who wrote a book on value-based medicine, recognized that in value-based medicine, which is highly adopted all over the world, there is a focus on outcomes, and the service providers or pharmaceutical companies, whoever's involved in this healthcare, ecosystem is only reimbursed for the value that they create in that ecosystem, right? So in order to be able to measure that and make improvements, you have to be able to visualize where that value is created. But unfortunately, with healthcare systems, you have a lot of siloed systems in which you can't kind of go poking around. So if you want to create like a point system outside of people's private data in order to be able to figure out, for example, in the area of stroke, you need to have the person taken to the right hospital. They have to be diagnosed within a certain period of time. There are certain things that if they don't happen within a certain period of time, the end result is that the patient takes a lot longer to recuperate. And if they don't recuperate, the cost and the overall cost of the healthcare system is quite high. So what you want to do is understand the point system, not necessarily the person's personal data, right? And so by being able to capture that outside of the siloed systems means that you can then use that data in order to be able to create these reward mechanisms, but you can also use that data to make improvements. And so what we're doing is using IoT devices in order to be able to tell patients what they're doing to generate better outcomes, because Michael Porter had never really taken into consideration the fact that the patient's also responsible for their outcomes. But that's an example of using blockchain as a mechanism for capturing the value creation without necessarily touching the private data. So I think that what's interesting about business models now, and I think that this is where some of the bigger opportunities are going to occur both within blockchain and outside of blockchain, is this ability to traverse outside of an ecosystem in order to build new business models, right? And that's obviously digital transformation. I mean, that's at the core of what people call digital transformation. And even when I look at things like PSD2, which is,
Exactly.
like open banking, that's all data driven, right? And that's really about enabling somebody to take data from one system and make that available to other entities in order to be able to get a service that they would like provided. And so what you're doing is taking data from one place, moving it to another place, it's calculated, and then a service is provided for that particular individual. So this ability to traverse different networks, to take data, calculate it somewhere else, means that you're not necessarily staying within siloed systems. You're not staying within the confines of organizations and processing and working within silos or business entities. You're utilizing the network and using data and calculating different places in order to create these new business models. And that's where it gets kind of exciting. I mean, obviously with the shared economy, people thought, oh, that's crazy. Who would ever do that? But as these models start to evolve and people think, oh, wait a second, that's not so crazy after all.
Yeah. And one thing I was going to say is, first of all, on the side of regulation and the data facilitating compliance for thinking about the financial industry, because there's so much more data, and thinking about the open banking and how through APIs, a lot of the data from banks has been extremely useful to serve otherwise underserved areas of the economy, and how the shared economy is coming to be integrated within financial services.
Exactly. And so these are all models that are what I'd say data driven on networks with, powered by, devices at the end, the computational devices at the end with individuals and an engaged ecosystem, right? Because you have suppliers and you have buyers on these networks. And so you might even have more different types of roles on these networks, but these are networked ecosystems in which they're not necessarily bound by the boundaries of an entity or a company. There are multiple parties involved and the data is traveling over networks. And so blockchain is one of the technologies that facilitates that. There are other technologies as well, but you really have to sort of take a step back and think out of the box. And I actually think that this is going to be where most of the exciting companies are going to the exciting sort of next generation companies that are being developed with this understanding and this sort of philosophy, because you're providing new services that are far more cost efficient. I mean, even the fact that financial services are embedded into customer journeys somewhat transparently, in such a way that the financial organization is able to capture a customer immediately, almost at no cost, and the provider of the service is able to get money up front. The person is able to finance that over a period of time, makes the price of the service less negotiable because you can spread it out forever, right?
Exactly.
Bring payments down. And so the provider gets paid right away. The financial organization gets a new customer, and the person can buy the product right away. So it creates some very interesting opportunities that are not bound by offices, entities, siloed systems, and then and they allow for different organizations and people to operate differently with each other.
At the same time, I was going to say this whole push toward digitalization and digital transformation across the board. How do you connect that with concerns about hacking also and the cybersecurity risks?
Yeah, which is an area which I've spent a lot of time, as you know.
Exactly.
And I think Aon, the insurance company, has stated that 83% of the S&P is now intangible assets, right? And if you think about 40 years ago, only 13% of the S&P was intangible assets. So that just goes to show you the amount of growth that there's been in digital and intangible assets within organizations. And then you read, I mean, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think, yesterday, that talked about, these countries that are, basically have sort of professional hacking teams that are either trying to steal secrets or people's data, or government, research around, military. So the level of hacking is growing.
Like you've mentioned before, I think in one of our past conversations, that today it's like easier to steal someone's data online than to go to a museum and steal a painting.
Yes, exactly. And what's interesting is that healthcare data is actually more valuable than your financial data. And the reason is because if you're able to steal the healthcare data, and you get somebody's information for somebody who's like taking, like a cancer patient that has a prescription for serious painkillers, and you're able to get all that information, I mean, that's extremely valuable because you can utilize that stolen information to actually go and buy these very much in demand pharmaceuticals using that stolen information. So it's interesting how valuable the data, consumer data is, but there's also a lot of other data from a corporate perspective that has become quite valuable as well.
Absolutely. So I think we're going to transition to Q&A now, because there's a lot of questions I'm seeing coming.
Wow.
So I guess along these lines, one question is, how do you get large corporations who have made their money in a centralized world to adopt decentralized blockchain instead? And I think this touches upon kind of like the structure of companies, right?
Yeah. And that's one of the things that's really hard, because companies aren't necessarily going to kill their something in their organization that makes a tremendous amount of money, because that's what everybody is, that's what's feeding everybody in that organization. So it becomes a little bit difficult to get them to, build out these organizations. So they either have to, create the entity outside or partner with a startup, because, and I'll give you an example, because there was one organization, large financial organization, who I talked to early on in this whole, crypto world. And, one of the things I asked them was, how's it going to work when the little blockchain crypto company that's, or entity that's very efficient is trying to use the same corporate brand to talk to a customer that's now working with the company with providing, a service that's very expensive. And the little crypto entity within the firm wants to do it less expensively. I mean, the head of sales for the organization is going to be really upset to think that this little stepchild is trying to steal their revenue offering a cheaper product. And so you have a little bit of what they call channel conflict in those particular scenarios. And so you have to give the startup space. Sometimes you have to sort of give it its own brand in order to give it the room to grow. Otherwise, it'll be stifled within the organization. And there's been a lot of talk about things like servitization, when you're moving from creating a product into switching into a different type of model where you're providing a monthly service versus a per fee transaction. And but even those become a little bit difficult because you're getting revenue one way and then you're switching to a different model altogether. And so there's always the fear of losing that revenue stream and that business. So it's a very difficult thing to implement within large organizations.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, thank you for your compliment. Why do we see so many thefts in the cryptocurrency systems? And here, like, we've been talking a lot about blockchain systems and moving to like crypto as sources of value. Is there a more fundamental problem? We can talk a lot about this because I love this question because it deals with a lot of the problems behind that regulatory technologies are trying to solve.
Yeah, but I mean, the main question is that the thieves are smart. They recognize there's concentrated amount of money being left at exchanges because that's where the majority of the theft takes place. It's centralized. And so if they can find some sort of a weakness, which they work hard to look for, they can go exactly where the money is located, right? But a lot of times, a lot of the thefts that take place have to do with end user error, not managing their passwords. So the exchanges get a lot of publicity over the theft because of the fact that there is such a high concentration there. But when, like, for example, the last theft from Binance that took place, if you look at the wallets where the money that was stolen was put into, they haven't been able to move that crypto because of the transparency in crypto, enables
another journey of data where the money is exactly.
Exactly. And so if they move that money and get caught, they're obviously going to be in a lot of trouble. And anybody who's going to accept those coins is going to do a lookup, and they're going to realize, oh, wait a second, this crypto is associated with the Binance theft. And so now what happens when it's stolen off the exchanges and it's reported, the crypto that's stolen just sits in wallets because it can't necessarily be moved, and people have the ability to look it up and realize, wait a second, this is associated with a theft. So it really doesn't give them much liquidity after the theft. So just kind of interesting. But the other thing is that a lot of people use their mobile phones, and mobile phones are vulnerable because hackers will do this thing where they get a fake ID card, they go to the phone company, and they're able to somehow port the phone number onto a different SIM card in a different phone, and then they're able to reset all the passwords, access all the accounts. And because people leave their crypto on the exchanges, which is something that is not highly recommended, it's not that hard for that money to be taken and moved to another address off of the exchange. So unfortunately, it's a usability cybersecurity issue, which there are sort of a number of weaknesses, but unfortunately, that's the exchanges have been highly targeted by the hackers.
Also, to clarify, there's hot wallets and there's cold wallets.
Oh, yes.
Cold wallets are not connected to the exchange, often like not to the internet. So that's considered safer, but at the same time, your access to your cryptocurrency funds is not as fast. Whereas hot wallets are connected to the internet, connected to exchanges, and there are even custodial exchanges where you can leave your money on the exchange itself, which is what we're talking about. Yeah. And often traders leave their money in the custodial exchanges to be able to access it quickly to trade fast. So that's where a lot of the vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And I think that one of the issues with having a cold wallet is that it's your responsibility to make sure you don't lose the password, right? And so that in itself is not something that people are really good at to begin with, right? I mean, most people can barely, protect their email accounts, never mind anything else. So having that responsibility, I think, is one of the reasons why adaptability, or the on and off ramps for crypto are not that easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is again another contrast with the mainstream financial system, that in the crypto space, the custody a lot of times relies on you. So there's no banks to custody your money for you. So there's a lot of different options, but it's really up to yourself.
Yeah. And then when you transact and the money is moved, it's too bad, it's gone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that risk can
Hard to
be
reverse.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. That's a whole different issue. The custody. It's a very difficult topic for regulators to regulate, and for exchanges, and it's just complex in general because of
because the visibility on it has sort of, the forensics around that has led to some interesting revelations with respect to like North Korea, and I think they found some terrorists in the Middle East, and there's been a lot of interesting forensic work that's been done through the blockchain to understand sort of the movement of that money. But the hackers are still going to go after anything that is easily portable and can be transacted with relatively little friction.
And also back to the point of regulatory technologies,
Mm-hmm.
Even though the data a lot of the times is anonymous in the blockchain, the journey of the data of where the funds go, like we said, is transparent. So you can find exactly where the wallet is. And at some point sooner or later, whenever there's an exchange between fiat and crypto, and then back from crypto to fiat, there is a place where the user gives their name. So there are ways eventually to identify people. But there's also privacy coins and different technologies. It's complex, but regulatory technologies and forensics, to your point, have done a great deal of like interesting advances.
But there's also different tiers of exchanges, right? So the top exchanges aren't necessarily going to allow for the privacy coins to be used with all the privacy turned on, so that there's no visibility in terms of the transactions, because each of those exchanges has to deal with the regulators, and they have to do the same thing that banks do with respect to the reporting. And and what's interesting about the exchanges as opposed to traditional financial organizations is that it doesn't take much for one of these forensic companies to actually just do an analysis and be able to identify, how many transactions are taking place with money that is labeled as stolen, right? I mean, if one of these forensic companies is able to do an analysis on that data without even asking the exchange, and makes it clear that there were these questionable transactions, I mean, they're going to have to deal with the regulators. So the level of transparency they have to deal with is quite high. And so, there's been, some movement by exchanges, like there was one up in, in I think in the Netherlands that moved to Panama because they didn't want to deal with AMLD5 and offer that level of transparency. But the issue is that once you start lowering the bar in terms of how much regulatory oversight you're going to require, then the other banks aren't going to take those transactions because it's risky for them to take money from an exchange that is not fully compliant. So, it's interesting to see how the technology, together with the sort of regulatory requirements, are creating sort of a high standard specifically for the crypto exchanges.
Yeah, yeah. And also with the travel rule that came out recently with FATF, where exchanges have to share information with each other about the beneficial owners and the people who are behind it. So that's going to raise requirements. I guess next question. Christina mentioned that regulators will have access to the data at financial institutions on a blockchain network, just by the nature of the network structure, basically. Do you think financial institutions would willingly join these networks with regulators to share their data?
So just to be clear on that, right? So when you look at like Corda and R3, they have a different type of distributed ledger technology that limits how much information is shared about their clients or in a distributed fashion with multiple organizations. I mean, the information is only exchanged between the two parties that are transacting together because they're the only ones that are entitled to that information. So it's not as if every blockchain solution is sharing its data with everyone. But when you talk about the blockchain crypto systems, the forensics that are available allow for a certain level of visibility. So if they're not being careful and doing everything they can to make sure that the transactions that are taking place on their exchange are legitimate, then the ability for one of these forensic firms to be able to call them out on not having been doing what they should is quite high, right? They're going to get caught, and that's going to affect their I mean, they're going to get fined and they're going to have to deal with a lot of things. So the bar is quite high for the crypto firms, maybe not for the other financial firms, but definitely for the crypto firms. And just to give you another little bit of insight in terms of the data, when money is stolen from an exchange, there are patterns associated with how the money moves. So traditionally, when you move money off an exchange and you do something with it, there's just one movement from point A to point B. But when it's stolen, sometimes what happens is they splinter it out and the payments go to many different wallets all at once. That sort of splintering effect is not normal. And so the ability to detect these kind of behaviors and say, wait, that's kind of weird, what's going on here? And recognizing that, something is being hacked. Those kind of sort of data journeys are visible and allow for entities to be able to determine that there's a problem.
And also to add more clarity, if anyone wants to look up further, examples of these forensic companies could be Elliptic, Chainalysis, CipherTrace, just as examples. And they've been consistently building their technologies. Initially, they started with tracking Bitcoin transactions and coming up with solutions for Bitcoin. And eventually they've come up with solutions for other coins and even privacy coins now in many ways. So it's interesting to see that progression. And obviously the first use cases of crypto were for payments, and the fact that criminals are early adopters of innovations, it makes complete sense that there have been a lot of concerns in the security areas. I guess next question would be, do you see blockchain being used to power a decentralized internet in the future? And as an internet person, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Cristina.
So I'm not sure I would see it as a separate internet. I mean, blockchain's not that efficient a technology. And while there are, sort of innovations that are making faster blockchains to be able to do specific, with specific use cases, I don't think that you would use blockchain for sort of an internet, right? There are actually people who will argue that you can do some of the journey stuff that we've talked about without even using blockchain. But of course, you don't have that trust factor and immutability piece of it. So I don't necessarily see that. I mean, I think of blockchain as being just this one connected technology that requires, as we talked about in the beginning, this engagement from a network perspective. And it works with a variety of different things. It might work with IoT devices and capture information from the IoT devices that are providing things like temperature and location or whatever that might be. But I don't see it becoming sort of the information layer of the internet per se that, first launched in the 1990s through the web browser.
Yeah. Next question would be, for lending applications, and we talked about lending a lot, so this is very relevant. Can blockchain lower origination costs for funding? From transparency and data collection, reporting to risk and due diligence, is this a common application?
So I think that when you're talking about lending, you still have, you're taking some sort of collateral, right? And it all depends on what the form of that collateral is and how you are locking it into the blockchain. With smart contracts, you can automate a lot of aspects of um, gathering all the information with respect to the ownership. But for example, if you've got a registry where it's got to be registered, you're then you're now talking about a different system that you have to connect to in order to sort of verify the ownership and update the register. So the ecosystem in which lending lives in has a variety of different mechanisms by which to keep track of the assets and who owns them, right? So while you can do smart contracts and you can do a certain, um, you know, you can do certain functionality more efficiently, it's not like you could prohibit the sale of a particular asset outside of the blockchain ecosystem unless you have some mechanism of locking down the title or ownership of that asset.
Mm-hmm. Also, to clarify a little bit the role of smart contracts, can we talk a little bit about that? Because basically you can automate transactions based on predetermined conditions, and they're not, it's kind of a weird term because they're not really smart and they're not really legal contracts. So sometimes they're called like dumb non-contracts.
Yeah.
Basically kind of how they would work in lending.
Yeah. So, I mean, so that's a thing. I mean, it's basically like an if and statement type of thing. And so when it comes to smart contract, you're looking for certain conditions, and then you're allowing for a transaction to take place if these conditions are met. And so that's somewhat simplified when it comes to contractually lending, because lending can be a lot more complicated than that. And so because there's like what does the lending look like, and what is the asset ownership, and there's just a lot of different aspects to that. And so there's been some just simple lending that's taken place with respect to like DeFi and a variety of other sort of blockchain mechanisms. Like for example, you could actually have your crypto as the collateral, but I don't necessarily think about blockchain as sort of taking over, the lending space as a whole, because there's a lot more complexity in that can't be handled by dumb contracts.
Dumb non-contracts.
Non-contracts, yeah, exactly.
I think one of the things that I was talking about that I've been discussing with my conversations with regulators has been the contractual relationship, and going back to first principles and the British English common law principle. As long as there is consideration and agreement and intent, like there's three conditions,
Mm-hmm.
then there may be a case for a smart contract to be considered a legally binding contract. But if not, maybe not. But it's still a smart contract.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's that's the difficulty with it, because it's just code, and the code is more or less like if this, if then else, right? So if you put quarters into a vending machine and you push the button, you're basically, saying, here's my whatever 50 cents, and I want whatever, or $1.50, whatever that might be, in order to get a can of soda, right? So that's sort of a contractual button enabled contract, right? You put the money in, you push the button, and out it comes. It's not a legal binding, and I think that if your money got swallowed up by the vending machine, good luck with that. But of course, in blockchain, you would have the transparency to prove that your money was locked there and couldn't get out or whatever. But it's not as if blockchain and smart contracts can simplify complex negotiations and all of the terms associated with sophisticated financial instruments and lending and et cetera.
I think this transitions really well to the next question about transparency, which is, do we really need blockchain to provide transparency? Why blockchain over other conventional paradigms and technologies, which can absolutely provide transparency too? But
so it's funny. I remember having a conversation with Oracle, and Oracle came to the blockchain table late compared to everybody else, right? But when I spoke to the executive, and I said, oh, how come you're not involved in blockchain yet? And they said, oh, we don't need to, because everything you can do with blockchain, we can do with our own databases, right? Which I guess is in all fairness true. But and even the immutability aspects, there was an argument that you could create a certain level of immunity in your data through a variety of different means, so that you could have this database mechanism centralized, and capture this information. But the thing about blockchain, in that it's a network technology and doesn't necessarily live in a silo database in and of itself, means that it's much easier for it to traverse across a bunch of different siloed systems. So so I guess to some degree, there are people who would argue that, but if you think about blockchain as sort of a network system that gathers information, across the network, and embeds that information in multiple places. The concept of being able to capture little data points, um, through a bunch of different processes, outside of the confines of an organization. So that's kind of what makes the blockchain more interesting as a use case, as a technology for those type of use cases.
Yes, my next question to you, which is my, it just makes me think of, what would you think about the role of open banking as an example of the use of transparency and data?
So it's interesting because I actually co-founded something in the open banking, open investment space, and I'm a big fan of that because I think that there's a lot that can be done with that data and technology. I mean, the ability to utilize banking information and be able to quickly calculate risk and offer a loan to small and medium business individuals that are not necessarily being served by large financial institutions. That to me is huge. And then you take this one step further and you offer that in, as we talked about before, within the customer journey, in order to be able to have the customer transact at the point of interest versus, maybe at a later point in time, means that the provider of the service gets their money at that moment in time. The financial institution is actually able to acquire a customer at that point in time, and the customer gets that product at the current point in time. And so it's beautiful. It's not like you have to shop for the financial institution because it's all within the journey. So this idea of having this sort of seamless presentation of of particular financial services at the needed point in time, I think is beautiful. And I think it's one of the things in terms of digital transformation that's kind of exciting. I mean, most people probably won't even know who their financial institution is that's providing these particular loans or services or whatever financing. But I don't necessarily think that particular service from a distributed perspective needs to have a sort of distributed blockchain. You do need a network because you're traversing across siloed systems to provide different services throughout customer journeys, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that the data itself has to be distributed. It just has to be enabled throughout a network. And so that's why we're kind of going back to Industry 4.0. Blockchain is just one of many technologies, but all of these technologies together sort of work together to provide a variety of these new solutions and new business models outside of these siloed systems and outside the confines of specific companies, traversing all of that to create these new models.
I'm going to say the last question that's been asked a couple of times is, how do you learn about blockchain?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that there's a lot of different aspects of blockchain. I mean, one is the cryptography, and that in itself is interesting. There used to be a Coursera course on the cryptography a long time ago. Some people will take programming classes and learn how to how to develop applications. But there's also other aspects of that, as the regulatory aspects, the legal aspects, the business models. There's a variety of different blockchains. Then you have all of the crypto assets, and you've got central bank currencies. And so it's got so many different facets that it's not like you can just go in one direction and you know, take one class for a couple of days and you learn all about it. It just has all these interdependencies that are somewhat complex and, you know, require more or less studying each one of these different vectors independently.
I will also say two things. One is the blockchain functionality. So I think the learning about the coding to some extent, don't necessarily have to be a coder, but a little bit about how cryptography works and the functionality overall about blockchain. That's something that doesn't necessarily change, but the applications of this field, it's a very fast changing industry. As those who have been following it more closely, one day you're talking about the ICOs, then very quickly it's over. Another day you're talking about Libra and the Facebook coin, and then a lot of it, the attention goes somewhere else. Today, all the hype is about DeFi. Yeah. So because it's an industry that's changing so fast, and the way it's changing is through innovations and innovative company proposals or startups, I just read the white papers, and it's a very common thing in the blockchain space. When there's a new startup, they release a white paper or like the website or like how they like what their business model. So I think because it changes so fast, looking at the actual examples of what's being done more than like overall theories, because it's going to change very quickly.
Yeah, but there's like fundamentals, like things like the the pair, the private key, public key pair, and the signature, right? And the fact that you can send your public key and your signature without sending your password or private key, and the fact that you used your private key can be verified just with the signature and the public key. These are sort of fundamentals, and so those kind of fundamentals are applied. I mean, they're even being used for things like passwordless access, you know, the new FIDO standard. And so these components of the fundamentals of this technology are now being utilized outside of the blockchain world. And so I do think that, as you said, you know, it's important to just keep learning in these little discrete blocks. And when you don't understand it, you know, Google it and either look at YouTube videos or read as much as you possibly can, because there are lots of little tiny pieces that sort of all fit together.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Cristina, for your wonderful wisdom and perspective. And I truly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope everyone did as well.
Well, I always love speaking with you because you're so knowledgeable and always working in all these amazing projects. So thank you so much for having me on your program.
Yeah. So the next installment should be around mid-November, and we're actually going to talk about a company that's working along the lines of not the FIDO standard, but an example of an application. So we're very excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you.